Right, well, Ryan and Sean, do you want to come up and join me on either side here? Just give a round of applause to both of you there. Thank you. I thought you'd made a run for it, Ryan.
It's getting a little tense in here.
So take a seat, guys. I'll just do a little introduction for the benefit of the radio audience. We're recording tonight's discussion. Very excited. This is the first time we've done an event outside of the UK. So you're all privileged to be part of the very first international unbelievable event. And again, a huge thank you to Everyday Church here in Northridge, and of course Kevin and Truth Matters Ministries for hosting us today and the fabulous job they've done. Let me just give a quick introduction to what we're going to be doing tonight. So tonight's discussion is why I'm an atheist and why I'm a Christian. We're discussing faith, reason, and the search for truth. And Ryan Bell is our atheist guest tonight, sitting to my right. Ryan joined me on Unbelievable back in 2014 when he was undertaking a year without God. Now, having been a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, he went through a period of increasing doubt till the point he decided to take a year out from faith and try on atheism. By the end of that year, he decided to remain an atheist, and he's going to be telling us about that journey in his own words and his search for the truth about God and Christianity. If you want to find out more about Ryan, lifeaftergod.org. Sean McDowell is our Christian guest tonight. He is the assistant professor for the apologetics program at Brierley University. And he's also appeared on Unbelievable quite recently, actually. That was discussing his book on the martyrdom of the apostles. And now Sean's going to be talking about his own journey as well and why, despite encountering many robust objections to Christian faith, he remains convinced about the truth of it. And he can be found at seanmcdowell.org. So again, do give a round of applause to both our contributors. So I'm going to step back and we're going to give 5 to 7 minutes to each of these guys just to start up by coming to this stand and telling us a little bit about their own journey that's brought them to this place, and then we'll sit down and have the conversation. So if you want to kick us off, Ryan, would that be okay? Great.
Thank you so much. And I want to start by thanking Kevin and Tracy for their hospitality here. Thank you for, where did Kevin go? Is he around here somewhere? Anyway, wherever you are, Kevin. Thank you so much for inviting us to be a part of this conversation and to your beautiful sanctuary and church campus. It's been a little while since I've been in church, and it's pretty nice. I like it. My church was not this fancy, but I like it. I like it very much. So thank you for your hospitality, for feeding us tonight. Thanks to Sean for agreeing to do this with me. And we have never met until an hour or so ago, so it's a great experience to be here. Well, let me tell you quickly a little bit about me. I was born and raised in a Christian family. My folks were Methodist when I was born. And very quickly, through some family circumstances, my folks became Seventh-day Adventists. Have you heard of Seventh-day Adventists? Anybody? Yeah, so we could debate that too. You might not even think Seventh-day Adventists are real Christians. I don't know, but that's an ongoing discussion. So for about 19 years, I was an Adventist pastor. I started my college career in the sciences and math, and then moved to history and English literature, and finally ended up as a pastor. I sort of tried to avoid it for a long time, and I just enjoyed people and organizing people to accomplish great things together. So that's kind of really what led me into it. I have a master's degree in divinity from the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary in Michigan, and I have a doctor of ministry from Fuller Theological Seminary. And I only say that to say I haven't just dipped my toe into Christianity recently. It's been a big part of my life for a long time, and I have thought about these things for a while. I served congregations, actually groups of congregations in some cases, in Philadelphia suburbs, and then most recently in Los Angeles, I was the pastor of the Hollywood Seventh-day Adventist Church that's just off of the 101 freeway in Hollywood Boulevard. That's where I spent the last 8 years of my ministry. We were very active in interfaith groups in Los Angeles. We did a lot of young adult ministry there. We were doing a lot of social justice engagement around the community, around homelessness and housing and economic justice and a lot of things like that. And then I eventually resigned from ministry in April 2013, which is a bit of a long story, but over time I was less and less in line with the doctrinal beliefs of my own denomination. And I knew that, but I was sort of in denial about it. And I thought I could change the church from within. People would say to me, no, you need to stay and change the church from within. And I was like, okay, I can get into that. But it's a very lonely enterprise trying to do that. And eventually they decided that I was no longer fit for that role. And we sort of mutually came to the conclusion that I was probably not a Seventh-day Adventist pastor anymore. I like to say I was the last one to find out about that. I was like, finally my boss was like, yeah, you're gonna have to go, I think. And I was like, yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe you're right. Yeah, maybe I'm really not a very good Seventh-day Adventist anymore. And so that sent me into a period of sort of searching. I went to Nicaragua for 6 weeks, which is a great place to go if you need some time to clear your head. I studied Spanish, and the rest of the day I just traveled around and looked at this beautiful landscape and did some writing and reading. And when I came back, I thought, well, let me find a new church. So at first I thought I would go to my own church where I was the pastor, because that's where all my friends were. And they kept calling me pastor and asking me what was going on and who the next pastor was going to be. And that got really uncomfortable really quickly. So I left there and I went to some friends' churches. I know a lot of the clergy in Los Angeles. And I thought, well, maybe, I don't know if I'm an evangelical anymore. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe it's all the happy songs and instructional sermons that I'm kind of over with. So let me go to like an Episcopal church where there's more kind of smells and bells. Maybe that will, kind of make me feel better. So I went there, and I know the priest very well. It's wonderful. They have a tremendous legacy of social justice and working in the neighborhood. But it was really waspy. You know what I mean by waspy? It was like really older, like middle class to upper middle class, liberal white people. And I'm a liberal white person too, but I just didn't want my whole environment to be that. It just felt weird to me. I didn't quite fit. So then I thought, well, maybe I'll go to the Catholic Church, because they have a lot of cultural diversity at the Catholic Church, and it didn't take me long to figure out I really am not Catholic. And so I just thought, well, maybe I'm one of these spiritual but not religious people that I've been really frustrated with for my entire ministry. People who told me that they could go to the beach and have a spiritual experience, and I was like, no, you need to come to church. So I did that for a while. I signed up to the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and on Saturday mornings, I would go to the museum, and then I would go hiking, and I would go to the beach, and it was kind of spiritual. But after a while, I realized that the questions that I had were much deeper. And so in January of 2014, I started a blog called A Year Without God. And the premise of the blog was not very well thought out. I was having Thai food with a friend of mine in Pasadena on like December 27th or something like that. And I had a book by this British philosopher who passed away. I'm losing his name right now. It's called Religion for Atheists. And I was always I was never really the spiritual but not religious type. I was always more the religious but not spiritual, which they're hard to find, those people. I liked the movements of religion, sort of the meaning-making process of symbolizing our life together and all of that. The spirituality part would never really stuck for me. I was never a good prayer. I was the last person to be in a prayer warrior type of environment. Nothing I ever prayed for happened. I just felt terrible at it. Like I was just a bad prayer. But I liked religion. I liked the trappings of religion. I liked the beauty and the music and the artwork and the buildings and, thinking about how we organize ourselves together to do things. So I just, this was difficult for me to figure out what to do next. And so I just said to my friend, I said, I think I'm just going to take a year off. I'm exhausted from trying to figure this out. Maybe if I just chill about it for a little while, it'll come to me, or I'll just take a break from God. Have you ever taken a break from a boyfriend or a girlfriend? You're like, I just need to step back from this and see if I'm thinking clearly about it. And it was a little bit like that. It was like, okay, I just need to think more clearly about it. It's interesting, though. I called it A Year Without God. It ended up being, ironically, kind of a year of searching for God. I spent quite a bit of the year talking to atheists and going to atheist gatherings and interviewing them and writing about atheism and learning about atheism, reading atheist books. But I also spent quite a bit of time reading apologetics, reading blogs and articles, listening to Justin's show, listening to conversations, debates about the issue of theism and non-theism and science and all the rest. And so it really ended up being quite a religious searching year in spite of the name of my my blog at the time. So I had a few other things, but I think I'm running out of time, so.
You got a minute or so?
Yeah, let me just quickly run through a couple things. I think for me, the question was, why am I an atheist? So I thought I would at least try to make an opening sort of attempt at that. So the first line of my very first blog post said, "What difference does God make?" And it was a pastor friend of mine who had told me that she was posed that question by an atheist friend of hers, and that she had a little bit hard time answering the question, because every time she would say something, he had a clever answer. Atheists always have these clever answers for everything. And so I said, well, that's a good question. What difference does God make? And it kind of stuck with me. I didn't really work on it directly, but it was sort of like noodling on it in the back of my mind. And when it came time for me to do this year, that came back to me. Because I was taught that having a relationship with God was like the most important thing in my life, and that it was the most important relationship. And the day I got baptized was like the most important day in my life, ahead of my kids being born, and ahead of getting married, and ahead of all those things. My relationship with God was first. And if that was true, then that should be like significant, right? It should affect me. It should change things. It should make me be a different person. And the flip of that is, if I am not walking with God, I should be not as good of a person, right? I should not have that sense of meaning and value and purpose in my life. I should feel a little bit depressed and all the rest. And I thought, I wonder if that's true. I wonder if I just go with this feeling that I have in my gut increasingly, that there just isn't a God, that there's nobody there, that I've been talking to essentially myself the whole time. What if I just allow my that gut feeling to be the feeling that I sort of live with for a year, right? What would happen? People ask me, like, did I feel like, sleeping with everybody I met? No, I didn't. Some people ask me if I was gay, which would be fine if I was, but I'm not. And they thought maybe that was what was so, really troubling me on the inside, that I was secretly gay and that I had to no, that wasn't it. Was I really wanting to just sin a lot, just get drunk all the time, or I don't know, what are some bad sins? Like rob banks or whatever, I don't know. I don't know. No, none of that. I wasn't interested. I wasn't some people said, is this your Rumspringa? You're going to, the Amish practice of teenagers being allowed to sow their wild oats for a year and then hopefully come back to the family. No, no, that wasn't it either. So there were a lot of, questions about those types of things, and it was just, but what I really realized at the end of the year was that the story of Christianity, I had almost, and this is going to sound super, a little condescending, and I apologize in advance, but I don't know how else to say it. I felt like I had outgrown this story. This story was great up to a point, but now my world included more people than Christianity allowed for. It included more knowledge than Christianity would allow for. I didn't need these boundaries between in and out, in groups and out groups. I just felt like everyone should be in the in group, right? I don't need this line between those that are saved and those that are lost, because I just didn't seem ethically right to me. There's stories I have about problem of evil, the hiddenness of God. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about some of these things. I couldn't figure out why, if God really wanted a relationship with me so bad, he wouldn't just turn up and let me know. And then there's some of the historical issues that we can also talk about a little bit later if we want, about my growing understanding of where religions came from and why beliefs in all sorts of things evolved in human history the way they did to answer questions that we were confused about. And I feel like that understanding of human evolution, human social evolution, the way that human societies attempted to cope with the unknown and conflict and crisis and mystery led to stories being told about the gods. And every culture throughout history has had stories about the gods to help explain the unexplainable. And when I finally got my head around that, I was like, oh, that makes sense. I understand why people have, God stories, because we, at some level in our social history, we needed those stories to help us make sense of the world. So at the end of all that, I thought, I just feel much more happy, much more fulfilled, much more honest with myself if I just say, I don't believe in God. amazingly, I'm still roughly the same person I was before. Like, I care about the same things. I still am involved. My next job after being a pastor was at a homeless services agency, helping to house the homeless. I don't say that to brag. I'm just saying, like, I didn't suddenly decide to go out and be an investment banker, and run a Ponzi scheme or something like that because I had no morals or something. I'm basically the same person I was before. But I'm fascinated, as I think Justin is, with these stories that people have about their journey. I have a podcast now as well. It's not nearly as famous as Justin's show, but it's a podcast nonetheless called Life After God. And I talk mostly to people who have gone through a journey of deconversion. I wish there was a better word for that. I'm sort of noodling on that as well, but people that have gone from being a person of faith to a person of no faith, and kind of how that happened for them. But I'm also really interested in people who've gone the other way. In a couple of days, I'm going to have a guy named Mike McHargway, goes by the handle Science Mike. You may have heard of Science Mike. But he was a Christian, and then an atheist, and then was a Christian again. So I'm super interested in that. How does that work for him and all that? So I'm really interested in the stories of people's journeys, and that's kind of what I spend my time doing now. Now it's your turn.
Thank you. Great stuff. Yeah, well, we will definitely dig into the story a little bit further as we go. Sean, come and give us your story now.
Thank you, Rob. Check, 1, 2, 3. Thanks, Ryan. I seriously, I commend you for coming. I know you're comfortable in a church, being here for 19 years as a pastor, but 3 years removed, probably most people are Christians. You're to be commended to come in and willing to have a conversation like this. So thanks for doing that. Justin, thanks for having me on. And church every day, my goodness, to have students willing to have a conversation about a divisive topic as important as this gets me kind of excited and hopeful for the future. So thanks for putting this on. I grew up in a Christian home. My parents have been on Campus Crusade for Christ. My dad, over 50-some years. So Christianity just made sense to me. I believed it. I followed it. I lived it out, did mission trips, and read my Bible and prayed and did all the things that I was supposed to do to be a good Christian. But there hit a point where I felt like I just hit a roadblock in my life. Couldn't go any further. It just didn't make sense to me. Decided to walk away from God and felt the pain and hurt and remorse of doing that. And I was at the end of my rope and couldn't go any further. So when I was 4 years old, I got down on my knees and I'm glad you sensed my sarcasm. Honestly, look, I grew up in a Christian home, and I heard these amazing stories of people who were wounded in war, who were in, drug leaders and cartels. They got out of prison. I always thought, maybe God can use me someday when that happens to me, but it didn't occur to me. I didn't really want to be in war or be in prison. And I share that with you because I don't have this grand, super interesting story. Christianity's kind of made sense to me as I've grown up. But I'll tell you a piece of my story that might be most interesting or encouraging in some fashion to many of you that are here. To understand my story, you got to understand my dad's story. If you know the name McDowell, you might recognize my father, Josh McDowell, my dad's written over 150 books. He's spoken up there, at least in the top 5 of people that have spoken to young people live, like in world history. He's committed his life to speaking, debating, writing, and proclaiming truth. And kind of his story was growing up in a really broken home with a father who's an alcoholic. My dad's older sister committed suicide. My father was severely abused by someone who worked on their farm for years until my dad was strong enough and old enough to take the guy, slam him against the wall and say, "If you touch me again, I will kill you." And my dad meant it as a 13-year-old. And he kind of grew up trying to find things that gave him meaning in life. And to make a long story short, when he was in college, met some students who challenged him to consider the claims of Christ. And my dad thought this was a joke. So he set off to travel around the world. Today you can just Google this stuff and find it. But you go back to the 1950s, if you wanted to see some of these manuscripts and consider some of these writings, you had to go to libraries closer to you, Justin, in the UK and actually study them yourself. So after a year and a half, my dad became a believer, restored his relationship with his father, has been proclaimed this ever since, and has been a very influential speaker and apologist for decades. This is the story I grew up hearing. Well, probably around 19 years old, and my wife will remember this well, we were high school sweethearts. And actually my first memory, okay. My first memory of my wife was actually in 3rd grade. We grew up in a little town called Julian. My friend Jesse, who sat next to her, on the bus, we rode the same bus, and he said, hey, I wondered if you could ask this girl, Stephanie, if she thinks I'm cute. And I remember sitting by my wife saying, do you think, she wasn't my wife, but I remember asking her, do you think that Jesse is cute? I don't remember what she said, but bottom line is I married her, and he didn't. And my favorite song is the 80s song, Jesse's Girl. Well, I mentioned that because my wife remembers well. We were best friends through high school and college, and I came home one time, I was like, I don't know if I believe this. And she was stunned, especially knowing me and my family and how committed I was for a significant part of my life. And really what happened is in college, you're looking at the early 90s, the first time there's these blogs in the secular web and atheists writing things that challenged the truth I'd learned growing up. I really thought someone wasn't a Christian because they just hadn't read more than a carpenter. I mean, how hard is it? And then I came across these really thoughtful, sophisticated, compelling people, and I wasn't prepared to answer it, and it rocked me. And I remember actually, it wasn't just a head game for me. I remember at least feeling the pain of like, if I don't believe this, relationally, spiritually, like this is going to set my life on a very different course. And I felt it was time to be honest with my dad. So we were in Breckenridge, Colorado, a beautiful ski town up in the mountains. And I asked my dad if we'd go out for coffee. I remember we sat down. I distinctly remember it well because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, here's one of the most influential apologists. And his son is like, yeah, I'm not sure I buy this. And we sat down. I said, Dad, I just got to be honest with you. I want to know truth, but I'm not sure that I really think Christianity's true. I'll never forget, my dad didn't miss a beat. He looked at me and he goes, son, I think that's great. And I kid you not, my next thought was, did you hear anything that I just said? And if you know my father, he's like the consummate optimist. He goes, son, you can't live your life on my convictions. You've got to seek after what you think is true and follow it. And he said, you know, your mom and I are going to love you no matter what. That'll never change. You don't have to worry about that. And then he gave me interesting advice. He said, don't reject the things you've learned growing up, just out of spite, out of rebel, or to be different. He said, only reject it if you're convinced that it's not true. That's one thing that my parents have really built into me, that above all else, whether politically, historically, philosophically, religiously, follow things that are true. And for me, when we ask the question, why am I a Christian? Ultimately, it comes back to the question of truth. And I'm sure that's exactly what Ryan would share as well. Not too long ago, I was speaking at a student conference not far from here all day, and these students asked me to go to lunch. I didn't have time, but they offered to pay, and we were going to Olive Garden. Seriously, I was like, yeah, I'll make time. And we sat around, and we were just talking with these students about different things, and I decided to stir it up. I said, hey, I'm curious. There were 6 or 7 high school students from their youth group. I said, I'm curious. Can you tell me why you're a Christian? And I'll never forget the responses. One girl said, well, my parents are Christians. Another student said, well, I like going to youth group. Another student said, well, my friends are Christian. Another student said, I like to play in the band. And just hit me, I thought, my goodness. Like if there's not deeper roots than that for any beliefs, it's certainly not going to last and influence your life in any powerful way. So for me to the question, why am I a Christian? It's because I think it's true. Does that mean I have all the answers? Of course not. Does that mean I don't have doubts? No, I have questions. I have doubts. But I'm a Christian because when it's all said and done, I actually really believe that the Christian story is true. And I'm confident as we get into the discussion today that we'll maybe enter into some of those points. So thanks for letting me share.
Thank you. Fantastic. Well, thank you both for those introductions. Really helpful to get a sense of both of your journeys. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Let me say that if you're listening and you would like to ask anything, we are going to make sure there's space for asking questions towards the end of the conversation. So we'll be aiming at about 8:45 to take some questions from the audience. I think there's going to be a microphone down the front. You can queue up and ask your questions. So do be thinking about that as we have the conversation, and the things that we don't get to, we might be able to cover when we get to that Q&A session as well. I guess I should say, because this is going to go out on my unbelievable program, I should also do what I normally do on the program, which is give out the email address. I always read out feedback at the end of every show. So if you're here and you'd like to feedback to it, you can email me, unbelievable@premier.org.uk. But that equally goes for the radio and podcast listening audience. If you're listening to this podcast or radio show, you're very welcome to email in your thoughts about today's program. That's unbelievable@premier.org.uk. So we're going to take this very much as I do with the program, in a conversational way between Ryan and Sean here. And so think of this as a conversation, and these guys are just eavesdropping on us, okay, for the next 45 minutes or so. I've got all kinds of questions, though, that I want to ask, but feel free to jump in if you want to have a say as well in anything that gets said. I mean, one of my first questions was going to be for you, Ryan, is and I think a lot of people said this at the time your story kind of went viral on the Huffington Post and so on, that you were this pastor who was taking a year without God, that it's kind of a self-fulfilling project. If you're going to cut yourself off from praying, reading the Bible, going to church, what did you expect but to find, there's no God? Because some people would say, well, you cut yourself off from the things that would enable you to connect with God. What's your response to that kind of a criticism of your journey?
Yeah, I've never heard that before. No, I'm kidding. A couple things. One is that I had spent the better part of 35 years of my life in that practice of church attendance, Bible reading, praying, theological exploration. And I guess, and I was serious about it. I was intensely interested in that relationship with God that I was taught to have. And so when it came to that year, it was, for me, a kind of an end of my rope a little bit. And so it was almost testing the opposite. Okay. I'd spent my life sort of working on the project of being a Christian, living out a Christian worldview, practicing the Christian faith in the world. And I had come to a dead end of that in a number of ways. And so the year without God was really, I wonder if I step back from this, if anything changes, as sort of a test if there's anything there.
Yeah. I mean, you probably heard about Ryan's story when it was happening as well, Sean. What were your thoughts, and what are your thoughts now about the way he undertook his project?
My initial thought, when I first heard it, I think this guy's already made his mind up. Now, I don't know you, and I didn't know the details. Because my first thought, I thought, for me, example, and this might not be a perfect illustration, but in my relationship with my wife, for example, if I'm going to take a year off from that, it's done. It's not going to recover. So I thought, man, here's this guy, and I've since learned different things. You asked my initial take. I thought, man, if you are, the scriptures talk about if you seek me, you will find me. In fact, I was reading a book this morning by David Bentley Hart called The Experience of God, and he says one of the things that you find across the great monotheistic religions is that we only find God when we seek him, and particularly through contemplative prayer. And so my initial thought was, well, if somebody's going to separate themselves from God, that person probably already has to be at a certain state, maybe emotionally, maybe intellectually, where a lot of dominoes have fallen, and this would be kind of the natural next step.
Is that a fair kind of description of where you were at, would you say, Ryan?
I mean, I don't think I would have known that at the time, but I think what I say now is that I was, two things were happening. I was deeply suspicious that there was no God. Like I was, I'll bet there's not. But I really wanted there to be. Mm-hmm. I was really interested in continuing my life, as I knew it, because everything in my life was built on this one premise.
And it would be very inconvenient for you to stop believing.
Yeah, very inconvenient for a whole host of reasons. And, but I, without my primary occupation as a pastor anymore, and, I didn't have a responsibility for a congregation. I think what I realized looking back is that I had really had a growing set of doubts that I was not able to adequately address because I was responsible for my church. And I wasn't going to just load my congregation full of all my questions, right? I was responsible for their spiritual...
So you kind of put off quite a lot of your
That's right.
Your questioning.
So it's on the back burner, and I'm like, one day, even like the creation evolution debate, I had come to the place in my life where I was like, probably the earth wasn't created in 6,000 years ago. I'm just gonna throw that out there. Like, that's probably not what happened. I'm not a scientist. I don't know how it happened. I can tell you that Genesis 1 and 2, based on my expertise, is not about that. I don't think it's a scientific account of how the world came to be, and I'm comfortable with that. How the world came to be the way it is today, I don't know. We'll talk about that. We'll figure that out someday, So I had been back-burnering all these things.
Right.
Can I ask a question? Can I jump in?
Go ahead.
When you say you wanted there to be a God, how much of that is this is my identity, this is my job, this is the life I've set up, versus the idea of a God in himself, job set aside? Was it both? What was the...
Yeah, I did, like I said, I didn't have my job anymore. So my job security was no longer an issue because that was already out the window. I was heavily into being unemployed by that point. So I really, what I thought was, if I'm ever gonna get to the bottom of this, now's the right time to do it. If I'm ever gonna spend some time, whether it's a year or longer or less or whatever it takes, to figure out for myself, and again, this is not the first time I've thought of these things, I've been to school quite a bit, but I thought, okay, without the burden of leading a church, without my income on the line, because it's often been said that you can't convince someone of something if his income is dependent on him not understanding it, right? So I think that being aside, I really wanted to know the truth. And I actually had atheists ask me about halfway through the year, why don't you just, declare for atheism? And I was like, because I really want to know. Like, I just don't think I know yet. And this is not a game. Like, I genuinely want to know the truth.
And in that level, there was a genuine sense in which it could have been that you would have gone back if things had turned out differently at the end of that year, and so on. When I interviewed you the first time round for the show, when you were in the midst of that year, you said something interesting, that you don't feel like you chose atheism, but atheism chose you. What was behind that statement, would you say?
Yeah, I think what's behind that statement is the sense in which we don't really choose our beliefs at all. Like, we experience something or we learn some new information and we affirm that this is true or that we believe it, right? But I don't just say like, well, I'm going to believe in leprechauns now. Sure. As of right this minute, I'm going to believe in leprechauns because I've chosen to believe in leprechauns. I'm like, it doesn't really work like that, because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I don't really believe in leprechauns.
So atheism was something you sort of fell into rather than something you clawed your way towards.
I might say grew into, but yeah, something like that.
What's your view on that whole thing of how we come to our beliefs, and do we choose them? Do we sort of just adopt them because they're there?
Yeah, I think we have, I hate to use a fancy term, but my professor, J.P. Moore, would say doxastic involuntarism, and
you're gonna have to
words.
Translate.
And he would say we don't directly choose our beliefs, but we can set ourselves on a course of study to indirectly shape the beliefs that we have.
Okay.
So you're right, I can't just wake up and go, I believe there's a pink elephant in front of me. But when it comes to certain beliefs, we can either dispositionally or intellectually study certain things to kind of indirectly shape the beliefs that we have. That's where I would land. Can I come back and ask you a question? I'm curious. I listened to a handful of your podcasts. And by the way, on your very first one I listened to, you said something like, I'm a novice. From your first one forward, you did a very good job. Clear, conversational. Seriously, you're a natural. But one thing you said on your third one, and it intrigued me, because I think we have a lot in common, but I think in some ways our stories might be a little bit different. And you said something, this was on the third one back like November 11th, 2015. You said, I remember being chastised for questioning things about God. Tell me about that. I'm curious. What did that mean? Or do you recall making the statement? Or if not, even the statement aside, what was it like? Because in one of the other podcasts, you said like you started to become an atheist 15 minutes after you believed. And I think the idea was you had questions and doubts all the way along. And I'm just curious how you process those and how people responded.
To be clear, like my parents and my grandparents, who I spent a good deal of my young adult life growing up with, and during high school I lived with my grandparents, they were never the ones to chastise me for questioning. It was after I became a pastor, and church institutions, like any other business, have goals and objectives, one of which is not to help people question things so much that they eventually leave. right? So that's not the goal of church, right? The goal of church is to, as I understand it, encourage the saints, give them strength to go and face the world, and that sort of thing. So, but I was going through some doubts and questions, and so I thought, well, what better place than church to actually, talk about the things that are challenging about our faith, Like we would pick a Bible text for the sermon, for example, and the first 6 verses were just really wonderful, like Isaiah, like God is going to bring you back, restore Israel to its former love relationship with God. And then the verse where we stopped reading said, and he's going to smite those other people and cut them down with the sword. Their blood will flow in the street up to your knees. And I was just like, we're just going to leave those verses off. We're not going to, because that's not very inspirational for, Sabbath morning worship. So there were those kinds of experiences. And I was like, well, what is that about? Like, how do I reconcile this? I had church members say to me, like, what about Joshua? Like, what about all this divinely commanded genocide? It sounds pretty much like ISIS to me, like, how does this work? And there was never anybody that really had any good answers. And they were, basically the church was like, that's not your job. Your job is to grow the church and, teach people, visit people in the hospital, make sure they're happy. And, and so...
And that was kind of you putting those questions on the back burner as time went on.
But I was honest with people, like, when I remember the last person that asked me about the genocides in the Old Testament, and I said, we will ask God together when we get to heaven about that. Because actually, this was the beginning of the end for me.
Right.
I said, I think that the Israelites and the leaders of the Israelites thought that's what God told them to do, but they were wrong.
Okay. Well, that's
that's really not okay. Like, you can't say things about the Bible like that when you're a Christian pastor.
That's the way some Christians do rationalize it. But that's opening up a huge theological can of worms, probably one we won't have time to debate tonight.
Probably not.
But I guess, where do you, hearing Ryan's response there, Sean, what does that tell you about kind of, I guess there is a danger in our churches, we tend to kind of bury people's questions, and that isn't necessarily the right way.
Yeah, I don't think we always handle doubt well. In fact, Gary Habermas, who's done a lot of work on this, says you can come forward and share almost any sin or struggle in the church, but if you say have doubt, like, people freak out, especially probably coming from a pastor.
Right.
I can see why people would,
Right.
And that's hard. Like, how do you have a space? I have a lot of friends who are pastors, and just space to share and struggle and be real, like, that's difficult. I get those tensions. I was a youth pastor for a year, not a pastor in the same kind of position that you were in. But I guess my experience was very different. From the earliest days, interestingly enough, my dad would just refuse to give answers to me. He'd always ask questions back. Go, Dad, what do you think about this? He'd go, well, son, what do you think? And it'd drive me nuts. It would literally drive me nuts. He'd do it on politics. He'd do it on everything. And I realized he was just teaching me to think critically. And I think, for me, when I had questions, and even professionally now, I still have doubts, and I still go, is that really true? Do I get it? Like, I've consistently had people in my life that just make space for that, and it's okay. Because I don't think doubt, interesting enough, Paul Tillich had a little book on faith, and he said, faith is not the opposite of doubt. He said, in fact, doubt is a sign that you genuinely have faith. So we tend to think doubt is completely rejecting something, but even the Bible doesn't hold that up. In Jude 1:22, it says, have mercy on those who doubt. And even Jesus, when he leaves, obviously for the ascension, he says, and they believed, and yet his apostles doubted. That's crazy. They saw him in the flesh 40 days, so if they're going to have doubts, of course I'm going to as well. So I think my sense is that we're both kind of, I'm just naturally a skeptical person, and I question everything. I go, really? How do you know this and that? And it's the way I'm wired. But my experience has been, as a whole, just room and okay, and people have walked me through that, fortunately, and I'm grateful for that.
I was going to ask you as well, what have been some of the biggest doubts or when it comes to the crisis of faith you said you had, and you owned up to your dad about it? How did you come through that in the end? He obviously said, look, great, this is your chance to own the convictions of your faith. What was the journey that eventually got you through that?
I remember 2 questions in particular, both of atheists that, interestingly enough, this is 15, 20 years ago, they're both now friends of mine. And one of them just talked about, kind of related to the hiddenness of God. Why doesn't God make himself more evident? Why doesn't God write in the stars, Jesus lives? Or on the moon, trust the Bible, or why doesn't
already here, yeah.
why doesn't every cell say, made by Yahweh? Because I mean, our toys say made in China, so why doesn't God do that?
Fair enough.
And it bothered me until I thought it through in some different ways. And second, it was the question of these dying and rising pagan deities. I had never heard the idea that Jesus didn't exist and it was a copycat religion. I'd never thought of that. And that kind of gets right to the heart of Christianity. If the resurrection is not unique and it's not true, even Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says, you are to be pitied, this is false. So I think for me, I had to give it some time. I had to give myself some space to be honest with myself and work this through. And I didn't make anything public. There's a lot of people looking back at that time in my life who don't even know I went through that period. But my mom and my dad, my wife, some close friends, some other leaders just kind of walked me through that. And I don't want to over dramatize that, but I think for me, I had to read both sides of issues. I mean, my parents have just drilled this home with me. So reading the Book of Mormon, reading the Quran, reading atheists, reading all sides. And that creates more questions when you do that. But I think it's the only way to honestly feel like, okay, I've done my due diligence here, and these beliefs make sense.
I mean, I think you see some Christians do take the view, I need to shield my child from skepticism, from other religions, and kind of put them in a bubble. The problem is that can be a very brittle way of building a faith, can't it?
Oh, I think that's a huge mistake to do that. And my parents raised us this way, and my son who's here, who's 12. I mean, we take trips to Salt Lake City and go have conversations with members of the Latter-day Saint faith. We go to Berkeley and bring in atheists and have them speak to our group. We've gone and visited mosques. He's come with me, and we have conversations with Muslims. I think you can't have a real faith in a sense unless you've been challenged and you're open to hearing other people's ideas. Now that can be threatening, but when it's all said and done, I think there's a confidence that comes when you're really willing to engage and listen to people. And frankly, it might have worked decades ago before the internet to kind of shield your kid, but every kid now, just one click away on their social media, is hearing ideas. So for me as a Christian, I mean, if Christianity's not true, don't believe it. I mean, honestly, even Paul said, if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain. If it's not true, don't believe it. But if it is true, it should be able to withstand some of the toughest challenges. I don't think we should live in fear when it comes to those questions.
I just wanted to jump in here too, and I said this to Tracy, one of the pastors here, a second ago when we were out in the lobby. But just the congregation's to be commended for doing this. I haven't been invited to do anything like this in 3 years that I've been, questioning and then becoming an atheist.
I think that's commendable for Everyday Church for putting it on.
Absolutely.
In fact, you've been disinvited a few times, haven't you?
I have. From my own alma mater, my college up in the Napa Valley of Central California, I was invited, and it wasn't even something big like this. It was a colloquia. It was like a small group of 10 students in a psychology class. And the president said...
I would agree with you, and sometimes when I've been asked for the rationale for doing Unbelievable, and like those early Christian listeners who were a bit concerned about the show, why would you invite atheists on? For me, those people are probably living in a different era when you could kind of live in a bubble. You can't now. In the internet era, you will run into, if you're a Christian, all kinds of different points of view, robust intellectual arguments against Christianity, and it's foolish to bury your head in the sand. So I applaud you both for being so open to doing this kind of dialogue. But what I kind of wanted to get to just before we come back to Ryan and more of his story, Sean, is was there a particular argument, something that really kind of nailed it for you, that actually Christianity, even if I've got lots of questions and maybe I'm not going to solve all of them, this for me helps me to believe this really makes sense.
Yeah. So I look at the Bible and I have some questions, and sometimes I read it and I go, man, this is bizarre. I mean, I do. I'm a Christian. I think the Bible's true. And there's sometimes I read it, I'm like, okay, Jonah swallowed by a fish 3 days. Okay? You look at stories of a talking donkey in Numbers. I mean, these are not my daily, regular experiences. For sure, just to be sure, I don't regularly talk to donkeys, just for the record. I know I had to fill that one in. So I read the Bible, and sometimes...
by the way, I met a talking donkey at Universal Studios. He was called... he hangs out with Shrek, but... So I have experienced that this week. He was very... very conversational, actually.
Okay.
So,
well, I will reserve the UK comments. No, I'm just kidding. I won't go there. I'm just kidding. I want to fully say there are bizarre things that are sometimes difficult to believe in the Bible. I get that. But for me, rather than looking piecemeal, I kind of look at the story in Jonah and I go, okay, look, if God can speak the universe into existence, if God can bring life from non-life, if God can take dead matter and bring consciousness into it, if God can fine-tune the universe, if God can do these big issues that any worldview adequately needs to explain, then some of these secondary issues, in a sense, are child's play to me. So it wasn't, the resurrection was big when I spent some time historically studying the resurrection and looking at the pagan mythology question, but kind of stepping back as a whole saying, what are the issues any worldview needs to explain? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is the universe fine-tuned? How do you get consciousness? How do you get life from non-life? Is there such a thing as free will? What is beauty? And to me, the theistic worldview consistently makes sense of those things that we deeply believe to be true. So I kind of ground it in the resurrection, and these bigger questions make sense to me. Even though I have questions on the outside and things that don't make sense and things that I doubt, I often bring back and go, okay, what does the worldview need to explain? And theism, to me, makes the most sense of those big issues.
Lots of issues there, and again, no time to go into them in any depth. But I'd be interested from your perspective, Ryan, whether you, at the time you were having doubts, kind of looked into those kind of classical arguments for God, for the resurrection, and other types of things. Did you kind of seek out those sorts of arguments?
Yeah, I did. And I think I was seeking out those answers and questions even prior to Year Without God. And I think, one of my, favorite theologians for years was N.T. Wright, who makes a robust, defense of...
He's been on the show a few times.
Yeah, I've heard that, yeah. And he makes a very valiant defense of the resurrection. There's some points there that make a lot of sense. But I think for me, what ultimately, I think, unraveled for me was that theology operates in this realm of the imagination, or the sort of the unknown, at the edges of mystery. And I was longing, and I think I even sort of leaned a little bit toward Judaism for a while. I mean, Seventh-day Adventism has a sort of a love affair with the Old Testament anyway, and so there's this kind of sense that the whole text of Scripture is unified more so than some brands of evangelicalism. And so I was familiar with the Hebrew Bible probably more than a lot of evangelical pastors. And the way in which Judaism is grounded in the tangible, the practical, the down-to-earth, and I felt like so much of my faith was attempting to address things that none of us can actually know about. Like where we go when we die, what heaven is like, whether people are saved or lost and how you would know. Where is Jesus? Where is heaven? Where is God? Is God a corporeal thing? Is he not? How would you know that?
Were these all questions you felt you needed to settle in order to carry on satisfactorily as a Christian?
No, because I did for years carry on as a Christian and I sort of basically said, those aren't, kind of what Sean said, those aren't really the deal breaker things for me. I think the overarching narrative of, paradise lost, paradise regained, kind of the arc of the universe, bending towards justice and goodness, and, as Tom Wright would say, putting the world to rights and all of that. I think that's, for me, where the story went and where I was still holding on. But when it came down to actual texts of Scripture, one of the key issues that really broke it for me was the question of homosexuality. And I remember the day that I said to myself, similar to the issue with the genocides in Joshua, I think Paul was wrong about this. I understand how Paul would think that in Paul's day, but I think if Paul were here today, he wouldn't agree with himself. I think he was wrong about it. And that's, again, something you're not allowed to say as a pastor, that you think the Bible's wrong, at least not as an evangelical.
Sure. I was going to say, you obviously sort of looked into Episcopalianism, Catholicism.
Yeah.
Some people might say it's still a kind of a leap to go to atheism from I have doubts about whether homosexuality is, consistent with Scripture.
But what happened with Episcopalians, too, was that they would write a book 500 pages thick about how the Bible really isn't against homosexuality.
Right.
If you just read it right. And I'm like, oh my goodness. Like I remember, one of the theologians of my own denomination, they were talking about some arcane, bit of theology, 300-page book, and he says, after spending 9 years studying in the, Hebrew University in Israel and Jerusalem, I've come to the conclusion that this is really vital information that everybody has to know. And I'm like, gosh, I don't have time to go 9 years in Jerusalem to understand this. It can't be that important if it's that inaccessible. Yeah. And if God really has this truth that everyone has to know or they're doomed, couldn't God be a better communicator about it? Like God was really clear, for example, in the Bible about mixing fibers in clothing, linen and wool and cotton, but really unclear about some really important things like slavery and the treatment of women. And
so all of this kind of, for me, is saying it contributed to your overall lack of confidence in Scripture as divinely inspired, and for you, obviously, that was a big key to whether there is a God or not, is whether He's left us.
Yeah, so there's two kinds of questions here. The one question is Christianity true? Yeah. Is the Jesus of the New Testament really what He says He is, and is Christianity true? Then there's another question about, is there a divine intelligence in the universe? And even beyond that, even if you can say there is a divine intelligence somehow, is that a benevolent thing? Yeah. Because the thing actually I had literally never considered when I started on this journey, and it was a friend of mine, a fellow atheist, I said, well, either God is, all loving and all powerful, or there's no God. And he said, oh, no, there's many other options. Like it could be a monster, it could be this, or it could be an indifferent, a child doing a science project, and he creates us and then he forgets about us and we're in the garage somewhere.
Kind of the deist view of a God who sets it all off and then stands back and isn't
right, he's forgotten about us, or something like that. So, I think those are different levels of like, is Christianity true? And so they kind of fell away in layers for me.
Lots there to unpack, Sean, but I guess one of my questions would be, obviously, for you felt the resurrection was a key point for the credibility of Christianity. Obviously, in Ryan's case, he didn't feel it quite made sense, and we can maybe go into some of that as well. But what was it about the resurrection that for you did make sense in your journey?
Yeah, so I wonder if we're approaching this kind of from two different angles, where in one sense to me, if the resurrection is true, like Romans 1 says, it's a confirmation that Jesus is God. If he really rose from the grave, never sinned, is the person that the scriptures teach about, there's some necessary authority that comes with being God in human flesh. So I look at certain things like hell, and I don't believe in hell because I like it. My goodness, it bothers me and gives me shudders. Issues like the issue of homosexuality you brought up, issues of, say, divorce, whatever it is. But if Jesus really rose from the grave, whether I like those or not, that seems to tell me, gosh, he sees with a moral clarity, with a higher authority than me. He probably knows what he's talking about. I'm not going to go with my instincts. I think this is probably true if he rose from the grave. So it seems like I'm kind of taking a top-down approach, and correct me if I'm wrong, whereas it might be that you're kind of taking a bottom-up approach going, I don't know about that, question this, not sure, and kind of unravels the whole thing. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it did that for me, for sure. I think these ground-level issues, and especially being a pastor, I was confronted by the problem of suffering, the problem of evil, the hiddenness of God. These are questions that church members come to you with, right? Like I pray and I don't think anything's happening, or I ask for my mom to be healed and she died anyway, or whatever. I went on a mission trip and I can't understand why all these kids are suffering and they don't have any food to eat or whatever. So these are the kinds of issues on the ground level, I think, that really, I kind of backburnered them for a long time and they chipped away at my faith. But then, of course, like you, and I totally agree with you, if God raised Jesus from the dead, then there's some other things we have to talk about, right? Like that's a big deal. And I remember talking to a young high school-aged apologist at an event that I spoke at, and that was kind of the point that we said, like, if Jesus rose from the dead, then yeah, we should keep thinking about this, I think that is an important
the point I'm getting from you there, Sean, is look, we can have debates about homosexuality, hell, whether Paul was right saying this, that, or the other, but at the end of the day, if the resurrection really happened, that other stuff will kind of fall into place because this central event is kind of going to
that's how I see it, and that's how Paul said it. Again, in 1 Corinthians 15, This is the pinnacle historical event. And if it happened, Christianity's true. If it didn't, it's a colossal lie.
I mean, this subject actually, funnily enough, in the very show that was broadcast today on Unbelievable with this illusionist mentalist Darren Brown that I spoke of, this was his key thing. Now he, when he was doubting, struggling with his faith as a young man, he says he went to look into it and he didn't feel it came up with enough credible historical evidence. Now this was going back 20 years or so for him. Now you undertook a similar journey to Darren Brown, perhaps to Ryan as well on this front. I'm just interested, and it'll have to be brief, obviously, but what kind of did convince you that actually this does make historical sense, this isn't a fairy story?
I think it's worth pointing out that how we evaluate the evidence depends upon the expectations we bring to the table.
Okay.
So somebody expects just an unrealistic standard for an event that happened 2,000 years ago. There might not be anything that would convince them. But to me, when I look at the person of Jesus, and of course you've had Gary Habermas talking about this, some of his writings were very influential to me. There are certain historical facts that the vast majority of scholars agree on. And I'm not making an appeal to authority. This is an appeal that the evidence for those is very convincing. Jesus lived, he died, tomb is empty, all these claims of appearances and changed lives. Well, if that wasn't the resurrection, we need something else to explain it away. So I think historically speaking, even looking at 1 Corinthians 15, this great creed that Paul shares, where he says, I pass on you of most importance, that Christ died, that he was buried, rose on the third day, appears to all these people. I mean, if Habermas is right, and I think he is, that's probably can be dated within 3 to 5 years of the resurrection. That's unbelievably early, especially as I started to look at other historical figures who are claimed to have resurrected, and even just sources that we rely upon that are often centuries removed we consider reliable. So to me, just looking at those basic historical events, I think, my goodness, there is good reason to think this actually happened and was convinced by it.
So for you, that was enough to settle the question for you that there's enough evidence here. I mean, I guess the thing is we're not just creatures, though, who just find, I've got enough evidence now, I'm going to believe. There's always more, isn't there, to Christian faith than I've got a really good argument here, so I'm going to become a believer.
Oh, I think that's true. If you asked me why I believe, I would be dishonest if I didn't say I was raised as a Christian and I saw in my parents a certain life that was very attractive. Their marriage, how they treat each other, their sacrifice for other people, their kindness, the way they live, there's something attractive about that. And I also knew deep in my gut, I'm not just going to believe something because it's attractive. I mean, I couldn't live with myself. I mean, you've talked about cognitive dissonance. I mean, it just wouldn't happen. So that was certainly made me consider Christianity, had a positive experience with Christianity. I don't have any angst. I've had some bad people in the church that have done things, but overwhelming, growing up as a crusade kid, I mean, my experience was just very positive, the way Christians treated me. But I had to know if it was true. Sure. So the resurrection grounded it, but it's also some of these bigger questions. I just started to go, wait a minute, something from nothing. What makes the best explanation out of that? How do you get consciousness? I mean, these big questions that seems to me theism just naturally answers.
Did you want to come back on any of that particularly, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to say about that, actually. I mean, I think that there are things that are, still great mysteries.
Yeah.
Like how consciousness emerges out of non-consciousness. I don't think any of us know that.
Yeah.
That's a question that science is, attempting to work on. I guess for me, in the place that I was throughout the latter part of my ministry and into the place where I am now, answering that question by saying that God did it, for me, short circuits my curiosity. Like, I want to know more about that. I don't, because I think, I've sometimes talked about the way that in my personal experience, and I think also historically, God has moved into the horizon. So, God was in pre-enlightenment very much front and center. Everything that happened was because God either did it or allowed it or made it so. And then as we began to learn more about the natural world, the heavens, and other elements of science, both through telescopes and microscopes, large and small, that there were explanations for things that we didn't have explanations for. And the God did it answer kind of moved a step into the distance. And as we keep doing this, the explanation of God keeps receding. And to the point where to me, there's like a trajectory there.
Okay.
And I think to resort to this idea that God did and that kind of answers it, for me is not satisfactory.
Is it a kind of God of the gaps that you're arguing for then here in that sense? We don't know how consciousness arose, so God's a useful way of answering that.
I would say no. I think if you look at consciousness, I mean, there's something distinctly subjective, first-person awareness that cannot be reduced to physical matter. It can't be. Thoughts that we have, our subjective experience of the world, you can't describe things like thoughts and pain and sensations in physical terms. There's something more to us than just physical matter. Now, one materialist response, and there's a bunch, like Daniel Dennett, I think this is more of a stop. Daniel Dennett, who's an atheist, I think takes the consistent response. He says consciousness doesn't exist. It's an illusion. So he knows how deeply the idea...
Sam Harris says the same thing.
With free will. He denies free will.
Yeah, and also in his recent book, Waking Up, he says the sense that there's someone in your head looking out from behind your eyes, that sense that you exist per se, is really an illusion. That the mind is what the brain does. Right. It's projecting this notion that we are here in that sense.
So to me, and I'm curious what you think, when I look at that, I think number one, that's like a kind of a naturalism of the gap, so to speak. Our worldview says consciousness doesn't exist. So to be consistent with that worldview, we have to deny something that is so self-evident to me, which Sam Harris does with free will.
That I am a person.
I think it's actually the reverse to me. I go, wait a minute, what explains consciousness? Is it that there's matter and it has somehow these inherent conscious states, or is there a conscious being and would have reason to make us with a sense of consciousness? That just seems to fit and make more sense out of it. And that's why leading experts in the philosophy of mind, people like John Searle and others, will admit that we don't know, naturalistically. So my argument is not just naturalists haven't figured out yet. My argument with that, the origin of the universe, information in the cell, free will, is that there's something about this feature of the world that points beyond itself
so that just
to an immaterial reality.
Doesn't work with a naturalistic framework for you. I was going to ask with you, Ryan, because it's one thing to say I'm an atheist, and now many atheists will say, but that's a very simple claim. It simply means I don't believe in God, or I lack belief in God is the way some people prefer to put it. But would you go further than that? Are you willing to make kind of positive claims about how the world is? Do you go the route of the Daniel Dennett, the naturalist, the physicalist who says, and all there actually is matter in motion, ultimately, and we are just the very complicated byproducts of a completely non-purposeful thing that goes back 14 billions of years to the Big Bang kind of thing?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
What makes you confident in that view?
I'm not confident in it. I just feel that is what best addresses the evidence without making jumps, without making leaps.
What evidence does it address?
Well, I just think that the physical evidence that we have of the universe, I think we, there are these issues of consciousness, leaps in development.
The fine-tuning of the universe and all those questions.
Yeah, if it's fine-tuned. I think one way to look at fine-tuning, and again, we don't have time to talk about all of that, but I think one way to look at fine-tuning is that the universe is fine-tuned for our existence, which actually strikes me as a really bold and somewhat, arrogant notion, that all of that vast space exists for us. And it seems rather indifferent to us, more or less, what's interesting, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think what's interesting about a lot of people who lose religious faith is that they kind of have this vague sense of spirituality, which usually goes something like, the universe is looking out for me, or the universe cares about me. And I actually think that's really hard for me to imagine, that gases and stones and,
I sometimes get this. It's kind of become vogue for somebody to say, the universe delivered me this, or almost like the universe becomes their placeholder for God or something.
Unless you are actually like a pantheist, and in that sense, I think there are like academic pantheists, people who have actually studied this and come to that conclusion. I have some of them that try to convince me of this, and I'm just not really there. But I think, for me, I think it's safest to make decisions about our lives, our personal lives, and the way we interact in the world based on the evidence that we do have, not on projections or guesses about the evidence that we don't have. And I just find that my life has been more fulfilling when I just take what's in front of me, and accept what I have, and not to make, for instance, like eternal life, like living forever, or like the afterlife. I find a lot more peace about my life believing that this is all I have.
Right.
And this was even when I was a pastor. I started to think this. So this is how I knew the end was near for me. So
Not the literal end, just the end of you.
right,
Yeah,
right.
I know what you mean.
Exactly. Thankfully, I'm still here for the moment. Yes. But yeah, I just thought it doesn't make sense to me that we would live forever. Like it doesn't. It's what makes more sense is that we would follow the same path as every other living thing that we've ever encountered in the history of forever, which is that it begins and ends, and then it makes room for another one. Like a tree grows, it dies, it falls into the ground, and it makes room for another tree to grow. And so that I live my life, and I enjoy it and use it to the best of my ability, and then I step aside and I'll make room for someone else to live their life. This to me seems like gracious, actually.
Okay.
To use a religious word.
Can I jump in and ask you a question? One of the first things that I thought of when I heard about your year without God was, is this trying to live without believing in God? Or is this an attempt to say, what does atheism actually imply? And then follow that belief. And what I mean by the difference is, let me spell out a couple examples, and you can obviously correct me if you think I'm wrong. But I think atheism implies a few things that I personally can't logically swallow. So for example, that something can come from nothing. That's an implication of most beliefs of atheism. Second, that there's no free will. Sam Harris writes this in his book, Free Will, that free will is an illusion. We don't actually make choices. Again, what Daniel Dennett says, there's no such thing as consciousness. It's an illusion. I'd say where Peter Singer talks about, he'd say there's really no such thing as human value greater than other species that are out there. To me, if I look at atheism, not atheists, I would never stand up here and say atheists are more immoral. I thought it was funny when you said that at the beginning, because a lot of people buy that idea. If you're an atheist, you're going to go do all these things. Of course not. That's not the interesting question to me, how Christians live or atheists live. The question is, what do those beliefs really imply, and what would it look like to live them out? So in a world in which there's no free will, something can come from nothing, there's not objective human value. And even Michael Ruse, who had on the show recently, said, if evolution is true, it means that morality is just fobbed off on us by our genes. It's a trick to get us to behave. So to me, if I were an atheism, I would have to really take those beliefs seriously and ask what would follow from that.
I think you're right. So trying on atheism, which I caught so much flack for, mostly from atheists. They're like, you can't try on atheism. And I'm like,
it's like trying on a pair of trousers
Sorry.
and then giving them back to...
Right.
No one
I
wants
was
to
like-
wear those trousers after you've...
I was like, oops, I guess that's a thing I did. I said something that, atheists talk about all the time. I'm like, okay, fine, I can't try on atheism. What would you call it? But it was that. It was sort of saying, okay, if there's no God, what else becomes necessarily, or at least possibly, an answer for, or a way of thinking about the world? So if you take, for example, no objective value or purpose, William Lane Craig's taken me on about this, like publicly. He didn't have the courtesy to actually sit down and talk to me. I asked him to do that, and I get one of his interns usually.
Well, maybe I could do something. We could.
That would be.
Who knows? Yeah,
that would be great.
We could see.
Okay, let me just stop for a second. Are you sure you want to have a debate with William? Let me just give you an out here.
No. In fact, I checked in about you, too. I told Justin, if he's a presuppositionalist, it's not happening. Because it's over before it starts. Anyway, so...
You felt the hard end of Christian apologetics, basically. Since
yeah.
you did your
Basically, so basically, he says there's no objective value on atheism, and I'm like, yes, that's right. There's no objective value.
That is your view.
Sure, yeah, but I don't see why. So here's the surprising thing, and why my experiment of trying a year without God is valuable, I think, I would offer. Because, right. No, it's okay.
I couldn't resist.
No, it's okay, because there's value, capital V, and there's value, you know? I mean, there's value, like I got $20 in my pocket. It has value. It doesn't mean that there has to be a platonic $20 bill in the sky somewhere.
It's got a lot less value since Brexit for me. So.
That's true, yeah. Sorry about that. I'm going to come to your side of the pond here, though, and exploit that maybe.
But
I guess what I'm saying is, so I wrote an article about this, and back when I was challenged by him about it, and I think what matters to me is that, or what I guess I now believe, is that our existence is finite, and we're lucky to be here at all, and the value that we experience and the love and the joy and the peace that we experience is in our hands to do and create and make with other people. And I realized because I had never considered this. I had never considered that there could be value or purpose outside of a divine sort of platonic value, capital V value. And I find that I have plenty of purpose and meaning in my life. And in fact, I feel more motivated to pursue it because it is a limit. There's a time clock. The clock's ticking on my experience of the world. And I don't want to live out the rest of my days discouraged and depressed. If I'm sick, I want to find a solution to that. If my relationships are broken, I want to fix them. If the climate is changing and the planet's heating up, I want to do my part about that, because in my worldview now, like, God's not going to step in and just like fix it like that. I mean, we have to take care of it.
I hear a lot of Christians agreeing with you, though, from a Christian perspective. But yeah, carry on.
I don't mean to cut your job.
Go ahead, Sean.
So I checked you out too. Listen to some. In fact, I subjected my family to your podcast for the
No,
past
so
few
sorry.
weeks. And my son's a fan now. You said something. This was actually the Life Without God YouTube video that I thought was very intriguing. You said, quote, "It's worth struggling to end racism, even if you die trying." Now, I think you totally believe that. We are on the same page with that. But the question is that somebody's subjective experience that somebody fights for? And you go, oh, yeah, that's valuable for that person. Right. My sense is you'd say, no, that's actually better to fight racism, objectively, capital V value, than a life who says, I'm going to live for racism. There's something deep inside of you, and me that would want to say, no, you got it wrong. I just don't know how you get that without there being objective value.
And I think how I get that would be to say, we've been doing the trial and error on this for a few million years, like we've tried, like, I'm by myself, you're by yourself, you're by yourself. If you have a piece of meat to eat for dinner, I'm gonna kill you and take it, and that works for a little while until, there's more of us and we realize we can't just kill each other and take each other's food. What if we cooperated? What if we had empathy for one another? What if we said, well, we could share the steak? Or what if we went together and hunted an even bigger animal and we could all eat? So over time, we evolve values. And I don't know if I would use the word objective, but maybe they are. They have become what works for us. Killing one another without like a really, 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 really good reason is not what works to keep a society of people together. We can't just go around driving on the left side of the road, for God's sake.
But well, it works for us. If I might step in, because we're talking about an argument which is dear to my heart in some ways, and I will admit I come in on Sean's side here, obviously, that I guess there have been societies, civilizations where racism, slavery, for instance, have worked very well in that society for the upper hand. The Roman civilization was built on slavery. But that obviously doesn't mean that, therefore, because it works, that's the right thing, does it?
Right, no, it doesn't. And I think, another misogyny is another one. I think there were certain kind of traditional societies in which racism and misogyny and tribal in-group, out-group types of relationships were very adaptive for communities to protect themselves. When you have a small group that's threatened from the outside, it helps to have this kind of tight in-group bond, and you protect one another. It's not so different than nationalism today. Like we'll say, we're Americans, and we're going to stand against the threat from outside, and we're going to all be like really tight about that, you know? And there is an evolutionary advantage to that. But I think as we become more, I would say, mature as human beings, we develop less violent ways of handling our differences.
So this is a fairly frequent response to the moral argument here, Sean. Evolutionary adaptation means these kind of moral values start to generally circulate in society. It helps us to get on. We can build a better, more flourishing society if we cooperate, basically.
Yeah, I think there's maybe an equivocation taking place on the word better. So there's a difference between something better to help an end that we'd like to have, such as society flourishing, and something that's morally better. And sometimes we can have something that is better for flourishing that's not morally better, and something that's morally better that's harmful. Those are different things. So for example, to use the word good, when we talk about, say, chess, there's a difference between a good move that helps you with strategy to actually accomplish the end of the game of the rules we set up. But now we're not talking about moral values. We're talking about a certain strategy to attain a certain end. I think when we say it is worth struggling to end racism, even if you die trying, ironically, if you die trying, then it wasn't best for you from an evolutionary standpoint. I think what you're saying is, no, that's valuable, that's right, even if it costs you something. And I think that's the kind of moral values that we have to ground, and I don't know how you get there with a secular mindset. There's one way to get towards, I agree with you 100%. There are certain values that we call moral that help us accomplish society and freedom and justice and human rights, the things that we have decided in this world. Most of us have, not all of us have. But that's very different than that being morally good or morally better.
So I guess my question back to you would be, how do you arrive at those moral values using the Bible? Because the Bible is just as endorsing of slavery as the old, civilizations that said, hey, this works. The Bible seems to be okay with slavery and the subjugation of women. And it's only after the Bible was finished being recorded that we've come along and said, well, that was an accommodation Paul was making to the church and wherever, that women shouldn't speak, they should be quiet and let the men speak. We sort of explain it away. So when people ask me, well, where do you ground your moral values? My question is, where do you ground your moral values? It's certainly not in the Bible, I don't think. I mean, you've gone beyond that, haven't you?
Yeah, no, nothing is right or wrong because it's in the Bible. Something's in the Bible because it's right or wrong. I don't think the Bible is the ultimate standard of right and wrong. I think it's the character of God himself who has spoken through the scriptures. Now, I fully concede that there's tough questions about slavery. We could talk about that. Genocide you brought up. Issues of homosexuality. Issues of women in the church. I agree that those are difficult questions. But in some sense, there first has to be a secular basis of why those things are wrong. I mean, from what standpoint is this even judging the Bible as being immoral before we get to the case of why is slavery allowed? Why are these things allowed? So I think we're maybe skipping a step. And I don't see how you get there on a secular
I think we're coming at it in that same way you described before, like you're coming more from a top down, and so I would say we all arrive at our moral values the same way. We think about it. We reason it. We say, well, what is in the interest of the most people in our group that produces a society that thrives. And sometimes, societies that thrived, at least in certain times in history, have embodied values that we would disagree with, embodying today. But I don't think that, just as I think a secular person concedes that there's not a, value qua value, in the sky somewhere, like there isn't, from my perspective, that a Christian would have to also say they arrive at their values through a process of reason, same way I do. Like you look at something and the Bible says, just be nice to your slaves, right? Like at that point in history, that's what the best Paul could do perhaps, with his instruction. And we would say, well, we have to go beyond that. Like we have to do better than just being nice to slaves. We have to have no slaves. And how did we arrive there? We arrived there by thinking about it, by trial and error within society, and slaves actually had something to say about that, right? They said, no, we don't want to be your slaves, and we sort of like worked it out. Like we worked it out, and so today we don't have, well, for the most, I mean, we don't have slaves the way we used to, at least. We have different kinds of slaves now.
Okay, well, I'll finish with a response from you, and then we must go to some Q&A, because I can see the time ticking by.
I actually agree with you that probably you and I arrive at most moral values in the same process. Reflection, intuition, consequences, experience. That's a question of epistemology, which is how we know things. The more basic question is the metaphysical question: what is right and wrong? Where does it come from? Is there a source outside of us? Or is this just a human invention by society? And if it's just a human invention by society, then I don't see how you escape ultimately the relativistic charge that one society says one thing, an individual says something else. We decide survival's the best, but a lot of people don't agree with that. If there's not a real purpose why we're here, then these are things we are inventing and we're coming up with.
It seems a little abstract to me.
Well, I guess it is a philosophical argument at one level, but in a real way, I suppose, it does go back for me, again, I suppose, to that thing that Sean mentioned. You're going to die trying to eradicate racism, and that sounds to me like you're invested in the issue of justice. Whether or not anyone changes their mind, you should be doing this. This is important, because that's the way the world should be. And
I'm still working that all. I mean, that was. I don't know when I said that.
Fair. Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm.
You want to know when? I think I.
Yeah, can you tell me? No, because there's a part of me that, and there is actually a secular take on this, that there is a objective moral grounding.
So I know atheists who do hold to objective moral values.
Yeah, in that weird use of the word objective. Yeah, I think there are people that do that. In fact, I have someone that I actually did, but we're both atheists, and he puts this stuff on Facebook all the time, and I'm just like, I don't see how you get there. Like, I'm with you. Like, I don't see how you get to, justice writ large. Like, there's justice, and that we all have to hew to that.
Well, look, we're gonna pause things just for a moment.
We're just getting started.
I
know, so much fun. I am curious what everyone thinks,
but we want to hear from the audience here. So can we just give a round of applause for so far?
If you have questions that you'd like to ask, we're actually going to be forming a line here. So if you want to stand up and just make your way here.
Yeah, Kevin's just explaining. We're going to have a line down this aisle. If you would like to ask a question. Now, I'm going to ask you, if you're asking a question, it's got to be kept brief, because we want to try and get through as many as we can. We're in a church, but I'm not looking for sermons, okay? And I'm going to ask similarly. I'll make sure both Ryan and Sean have a chance to... Look at this queue. It's going right to the back. Wow, we may have trouble getting through all of these.
We are definitely...
I have to be in San Diego by 11 a.m.
But we'll try and get through as many questions as possible, so keep them brief. I'll give a short time just for both Sean and Ryan to respond on each question. And when you've asked your question, please hand the microphone back to Kevin.
I think you're going to get a lot more than me. I don't know.
Go ahead and give us your name and then your question.
Hi, I'm Kaylee. I have a question for Ryan. I was wondering, so now that you've come to the side of atheism, do you have now any doubts about atheism? And if so, like, what would those be?
Yeah, of course, I do, and they would be along the lines of the things that Sean raised. I think, just the remaining mysteries, and there are many, about our existence. So those are the things that I wonder about, and certainly there is the possibility that I still have in my mind that there is certainly a possibility that there is, a divine creator in a certain way that I haven't been able to figure out in my mind to sort of plug all the holes.
Just if I might interject then, why do you go for atheist rather than agnostic?
I mean, I think they answer two different questions. I mean, so I think I would typically say under cross-examination that I'm an agnostic atheist. So I'm a person who doesn't believe there's a God, but I'm not entirely like sold. Like, but we're dealing here in probabilities, you know. So we're not none of us are dealing in certainties. I don't think. I don't think you would say you're certain about all of it either. But I think we're dealing in probabilities, and I came to the point where the probability in my mind of there being a God was approaching zero, and I thought, okay, then at this moment I don't believe that there is a God.
Do you want to make a quick response, Sean? And
Mike, I guess I would ask a question back. I'll give you my time. What would it take for you to come back?
Oh, that's a hard question, and I haven't come up with a good answer because I'm tempted to say something like, God would show up in front of me and say, "Hey, believe in me," But then I would just worry that I was had a psychotic break. Yeah. Because people that see things and hear things like that are usually sick, right? So I'm like, okay, so I don't know. I mean, maybe if someone grew a limb or rose from the dead, that would be impressive.
Well, he says someone did.
I know. I've heard about that. I've heard a rumor about that.
We'll go to another question. Yes.
Yes, my name's Art. I have a question for Sean, but I want a real quick comment before I ask it. I remember Christopher Hitchens, hearing him say several times, if someone sits next to you on the subway or the bus close to you and says, God was talking to me this morning, do you instinctively move closer or away? Now, question for Sean. I've always been puzzled by the apologist comments about objective morality, and I think Ryan hit that pretty well. You said you don't get it from the Bible, you get it from the character of God. From where do you learn the character of God?
I think two ways. I think one, through reasoning and reflection. The ontological argument, if it is sound, tells us that there must be a maximally great being. And if there's a maximally great being, by definition, it would include moral excellence. I think we can actually get there by the moral argument. If objective morality exists, there must be a God. Objective morality exists, therefore there's a God. So as a Christian, Romans 2 says that even people who don't have the law know there's such a thing as the law because it's written on our hearts. So obviously, I believe that as a Christian. I think we can reflect upon the world in the way C.S. Lewis beautifully described at the beginning of Mere Christianity. There's this sense of oughtness, this sense of moral duty, this sense of commitment to truth and justice outside of me. I think we can reason there from the bottom up. And I also think, because I believe that Jesus is God and rose from the grave and he held a certain view of Scripture, that the Scripture also can tell us about right and wrong. So I think it's both.
Do you want to add anything to that?
No, not really.
Cool. Okay, that's fine. Okay, yes, go ahead.
Hey, how's it going? My name's Mark, and I just want to tell you guys really quick, especially you, Ryan. What courage, and I think stuff like this we should have everywhere in America. I mean, this is wonderful. But my question is to you, Ryan. I know you said you grew up in a Christian Adventist household and became a pastor. If you could just briefly tell us, what was your personal conversion experience where you said, I truly know Jesus? I know later you said, I figured out he didn't exist. Right. But what was where you like, I know Jesus is my Savior, your surrender, whatever,
Yeah, I was, I actually just wrote about this. I'm working on a book about my story, and I just wrote about this, so it's a little fresh for me. I was at summer camp up in near Idlewild, not too far from here, and I was, a part of a worship experience where I felt that strange warming in my heart. I had that evangelical sort of experience of God loving me, and I was at a time in my life when my mom and dad had broken up, and my mom was with a guy that was not very nice to me, and I was a little homesick kid, and I felt really alone in the world. And the pastor and my camp counselor just told me that Jesus loved me, and that no matter what happened to me or no matter who did anything to me, that they really couldn't ever hurt me because I was safe with God. And that was about the best news I had ever heard, in my young life. And I was like, well, I dig this guy. And so I actually contacted my pastor when I got home, and I did all the Bible studies and was baptized. And I had a lot of those kinds of experiences, even in college, of, walking in the woods and communing with God and feeling like God was with me, that sense of companionship. So I think that was kind of how it happened for me.
Do you want to add anything to that, Sean?
Can I ask a question back? I had a lot of experiences like that going to camp. I think I prayed the prayer, I don't know how many times, to be honest. I don't know exactly when I became a believer, but I know it was sometime after my questioning period, there was a profound sense where I really thought, man, I haven't committed the great sins. I'm pretty holy. I'm better than everybody else. I had a deep sense of my own sinfulness and need for God. Is that a part of your experience, or was it more just God loves me?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, there were times that I would just weep and just, in the biblical expression, gnash my teeth practically, that I was desperately sinful. I would even I remember praying and asking God to put on me a sense of my own sinfulness and my need for him. And usually when I did that, I felt pretty terrible about myself and what I had done. And I'm not talking about killing anybody or doing anything horrible. I was just, convinced that because that's part of the gospel story, is that you are lost without God. And so I think to really sense deeply that need for God, you need to really also embrace your worthlessness, which is actually now one of my larger problems with the gospel story, is the deep impression that it leaves on people that they're worthless.
Yeah, my experience was different. It was never a sense of worthless. I mean, my goodness.
It was corresponding worth in God's eyes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, to me, and what the scriptures teach is made in the image of God. If we bear the imago Dei, we have infinite dignity and value and worth. But there's a sense of brokenness, obviously, before God that is sin. But I guess I'm interested to use the word worthless. Maybe we'll have that conversation. I'm curious what you mean by that.
But very helpful to kind of give that side of your story as well. Yes, next question.
Alrighty. Well, so this is I know we kind of already, or you guys already touched on this topic, objective and subjective moral values a little bit, but this question is for Ryan. So I know in the beginning you kind of brought up or were complaining or upset about the, quote unquote genocide of God, or, his judgments per se. So, one, do you believe in objective moral values, objective or subjective? Why or why not? And given an atheistic worldview, why would the judgment of God, or in this case, as you would say, judgment of nations, be immoral or wrong, given your worldview?
So this, it's coming back to
that question. And because we have talked about that a bit, I'll try to be really brief. But I think it's this idea of objective value for me is kind of like a red herring. I don't know that it's. I think to me, it doesn't take a lot of explaining to know that wiping out an entire group of people is wrong. It doesn't, it's not in keeping with our evolution. It's not in keeping with our sense of what it means to be human from a secular perspective or from a religious perspective. So to me, the idea that because I'm an atheist, I could somehow sort of wink at, and I'm not saying you're saying that about me, but I'm just saying this idea that because I'm an atheist, I have no moral basis to say that a genocide is wrong. It just seems so kind of unthinkable to me. Like harming children, for example. There's nothing, even cats and dogs and I suppose there are some fish that eat their young, or praying mantises eat their sexual partner after. But anyway, there's animals and creatures that do that. But I think evolved creatures and more advanced creatures, they don't hurt their fellow creatures.
Lions do. Lions eat their young.
Yeah?
They're pretty advanced, right?
I guess so.
Hey,
I don't know why. We'd have to ask them why they do that. Why do they?
Good luck with that.
Why do they?
Hey, let me just throw in real quickly, because this issue's come up a few times. The best book, whether you're skeptic or believer, on the question of genocide, and there's questions whether that term should even be used in the Old Testament, is Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster? That's the one to wrestle with if this question is relevant to you.
Thank you. Yeah, another question.
Hey, what's up, guys? Thank you for this experience. My question's for Ryan. Ryan, specifically in regards to consciousness, you said it's a mystery, like the answer did. But it seems to me that we only have two options, either a naturalistic, materialistic explanation or a non-materialistic explanation. So to me, you didn't answer that question, really. You just said it's a mystery. Since you're a naturalist, can you please give us one naturalistic explanation of how consciousness came about without saying we're not conscious at all, like Daniel Dennett?
No, and I'm not sure I'm a Dennetite. I'm not sure I agree with Daniel Dennett that we're not conscious. I mean, I guess, my answer to that question is I don't know. Like, I don't know. I don't mean mystery in the sense that we just get to wave our hands at it, which I think is, I don't mean to be mean, but kind of a Christian use of the word mystery. Like, it's a mystery, so we just get to forget about it, or just kind of pretend like it's not there. So to me, I said, what I mean is that I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. Does anyone know?
But you are confident there will be, even if we never discover it,
our
there is a
brains,
naturalistic explanation.
Sure, like I think we evolved in the way that biologists say that we did, along a trajectory.
Now, Sean earlier said he thought that was a naturalism of the gap. So there's a sense in which that itself is a faith position, that there will always be a naturalistic
Of course, because
explanation.
there are, if you've ever seen the Futurama episode about this, there's so you have this gap, right? A scientific gap. And so a scientist discovers, oh, that's the thing that fills the gap. And then now there's another gap. Actually, there are two gaps now, one on either side of, you know what I mean? So every time you discover something new, there's still another gap. We're not going to ever have a video recording of exactly, 4.5
But you're confident that because we've had good naturalistic explanations thus far, we will continue to always see naturalistic.
Yeah, and we may never have answers to certain questions, or we may. Like, I think, and again, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a neurologist. I'm not a brain researcher or anything like that. Not even close. But it just seems to me that the overall trajectory of evolution would lead us to a point where there's a leap. And there was actually a great Radiolab episode at a talking about a molecular level about how, this unlikely thing happened with two cells merging, and something happened that had never happened before that gave rise to the possibility, the future possibilities. So these little unlikely things obviously had to happen in the history of evolution for us to be where we are today.
Do you want to respond a little?
I have sympathy. You've been put on the spot, like moral values, resurrection, consciousness. I mean, these are tough questions that people study for years. I mean, if you say it's a mystery, fine. That's okay. We can't answer everything.
I don't mean it's a permanent mystery. Maybe it will be. I don't know.
So to me, we have to look at this feature of consciousness and ask ourselves what worldview, naturalism or theism or something else, best explains it. And there's a prominent philosopher of mine. He's been a prominent philosopher of mine named Jaegwon Kim, and he wrote a book a few years ago called Mind in a Physical World. Gets to the end of it and essentially says, we have no clue how to explain consciousness, but we know there's no such thing as God and the soul that explains it. Well, interestingly, the God of the gaps, there's only a gap if we assume that there's a naturalistic explanation for this. I think we do have an explanation. And I think if we find consciousness, which has a subjective, immaterial nature to it, it's best explained as an immaterial, conscious being. So that's not a God of the gaps argument unless you necessarily assume that there's a physicalist, naturalist explanation.
I remember when John Lennox was accused of this once, and he said, well, there's, if you like, bad gaps and good gaps. And there are some gaps we're led to by the evidence that cry out for a theistic explanation.
And this might be a permanent gap in the sense that, and this is again something that some scientists of mine say, that the reason consciousness is a particularly tough nut to crack is because you have to somehow turn your own consciousness on itself. Like, how do you examine your own consciousness when it's the thing you're trying to examine? You know what I mean? So it's very difficult to actually examine it, which is why a lot of Eastern religions spend so much time thinking about mindfulness and meditation, which is the closest, according to some, that you can get to really being aware of your own thought processes.
I think you're right that makes it hard to flip it on our own consciousness, but I also think it's something about the nature of consciousness itself that has properties that physical matter doesn't have. And in principle, you can't get aboutness or a first-person awareness from matter itself. It's a bridge that in principle cannot be crossed unless we change what we mean by consciousness. So I don't think it's a gap that naturalism can ever solve, because there's a part of it that goes beyond matter itself.
We've got quite deep just in the Q&A. This is amazing.
We should
let's
move
go
on.
to another question. Yes.
Ask us an easy one.
Yeah, please. What's your favorite color? That'll do.
Hi, Sean. So I really appreciated hearing about, I kind of felt like you talked about believing in God from two directions. Like, we have this feeling inside of us of what God ought to be like. That there should be an all-powerful God. And then we have Scripture telling us what God is. And this is in the context of objective morality. But what's the connection point between those two ideas, between what the authority of Scripture tells us and what our ideas inside of our mind tell us? How do we know that it is Scripture that's true, and that Yahweh is the God who exists, not another God?
Okay, so I got to make sure that I understand your question correctly. I do think the Bible is authoritative, but I think its authority comes from that it's written and inspired by God himself. So if you just worship the Bible, that leads to idolatry and legalism. I'm saying it's the person and character of God, and I believe that we can look at this historically, we can look at fulfilled prophecy. I think we can look at certain things within the character of Scripture itself that I think has the ring of authenticity, in particular the person and the life of Jesus. So, I don't know how much depth you would want me to go into, but I think it has to go back to the evidence. How do we know the Bible's true? Look at the evidence for it. How many manuscripts are there? Are they early? Is there genuine fulfilled prophecy? Is there embarrassing facts that we find that show somebody actually cares about truth? I think, like my friend J. Warner Wall's Cold Case Detective says, if you analyze the Scriptures through the lens of forensic analysis, in particular Mark, it has the ring of authenticity to it. So I think we just have to go and examine it and see where the truth itself actually points. I think that's all we can do.
Do you want to make a quick response on that, Ryan?
No, I'm actually really super excited that there's some younger members of the audience in line, so I'm kind of eager to know what they have to say.
Hi. Yes, do you want to give us your name and your question?
Okay, I'm Edward, and I just want to know, haven't you ever had a situation where you've seen God?
So is this to either guest? Okay, have you ever seen God, have experienced God in some way?
Like with my eyes? Yeah. No. That would be impressive. That would probably be one of those things that would seal the deal.
But could you, well, you just said, could I trust my eyes?
That's
if
true,
I
don't know. Yeah, that's true. You make a good point.
So,
man, you caught me in a flip-flop.
Have you ever seen God or experienced God beyond the philosophical arguments, Sean?
It says in John 4:24 that God is spirit, so we can't see God because he's not physical any more than you can see a number in that sense. There's certainly times where I felt like I've experienced God and things that have happened that I think are miraculous. So the quick answer is yes. But honestly, my faith is not based upon an experience I have or haven't had. I think it needs to be grounded in what you think is true, because our experiences and how we interpret them, can be all over the map. And the last thing, how old are you? 14?
14.
Good for you for having the courage to stand up and ask a question. Way to go.
That's right.
Great stuff.
Hi, my name is Emily, and my question is mostly for you, Sean, but also for you, Ryan, since I want to work for Stand to Reason when I grow up, so yay! This is my pastor, or ex-pastor, he knows this, but so basically I have this uncle who used to be on fire for Jesus, but then he just right now he's gross. And so you could say you could say he's an atheist. I guess that would probably be the best word to describe him right now. But I would like to know, how do you get somebody like that who doesn't even want to talk about Christianity or even about atheism? How would you, try to engage him into a conversation where it would, like, first of all, I want to know more about why, since nobody in my family even, like, doesn't even want to talk about that.
So how do you kind of begin the conversation with someone who's just kind of been turned off altogether?
Yes.
Talking about religion or atheism or anything like that. Maybe start with you, Sean.
I'm curious what you think. I'd love to know.
I mean, is it a problem for you? I mean, is that even like a question? If someone isn't interested.
I mean, this is why I love podcasting. So I have like a list of questions. Like for me, like I would start by just saying, what's most important to you? Like, what's really important to you? What are your values? It might be it might be family. It might be, a hobby that he has. It might be learning about something. I mean, at the very least, you're going to learn something really cool. Is it your uncle, you said? Yeah, you'll learn some really great stuff about your uncle. I mean, you could even just straight up ask him, like, did something happen? Or did you just get bored with it? Or like, or maybe there was an experience that he had of religion or some person that he met that really, upset him.
You could come on my show.
Yeah, I think I think you just take an interest in him as a human. And I mean, for you, even more than that, as an uncle. What makes his heart beat fast? What makes him excited? What does he love? What irritates him? These are the kind of curiosities, I think, to have about one another.
Great.
I think it's a great response. I mean, honestly, somebody on any side of the issue where they are in this, there might not be anything you can do. Somebody who doesn't want to talk about God, if they're not open to it, you can't magically force somebody to do something because we have something called free will. But I think...
Well, not according to Sam Harris, but...
There you go. There you go. I think the best thing, and I think Ryan is right, people can have a variety of reasons for their beliefs, for God and against. It could be that the person was hurt. It could be genuine intellectual reservations. It could be hypocrisy the person has seen. It could be a moral reason. I mean, for my father, growing up as more of an agnostic, trying to disprove God, when he started hearing these ideas that God is a loving father, his image of a father was like abuser and distant. Why would I want a heavenly father? That's a deep-seated emotional issue that kept him from God. Now, I'm not saying that's true for your uncle. I don't know him. But I think I would honestly sit down and just say, tell me your story. Yeah. I mean, you're younger, so you only have so much influence over somebody who's older than you. I mean, just show some humility. You'll learn some stuff. You'll build a relationship. And if he's not open now and you show that you genuinely care and love about him as a person, and you listen, then at the time when he does care, chances are you would be somebody he would probably talk to.
Great, thank you very much.
Sure.
Hi.
This question's for Ryan. First of all, do you believe in the Big Bang?
Now, is this one of a few questions coming? I can tell, firstly.
It's like a trick question.
Well, I have not researched the subject personally, but people that I know who are very smart say, yeah, roughly, this is whatever it means, the Big Bang, that there was a singularity that happened in the beginning of our universe.
And why?
Okay. I thought we were moving on to easy questions. Weren't we going to move on to easy questions? I don't think anyone knows the answer to why. There are various speculations. There are multiverse explanations that this, universe sort of emerged out of another one. And now I've said everything I know about that. I think it's basically the way science works is you observe all this data and then you create an explanation or you posit an explanation that makes sense of the most of the data. And so this idea that there was this point, 13.8 billion years ago when everything goes back to that point is a fairly universally accepted scientific notion. So
I mean, toss that over to you as well, Sean. Some Christians I meet are really keen on using the scientific evidence for the Big Bang as in some way evidence for God. Others actually don't like going there. They say, hey, the evidence could change. You're kind of basing your your evidence for God on something that inevitably does change over time, the science of these things.
I think William Lane Craig is right to carefully state the Big Bang isn't a proof of God, but it supports one premise in an argument for the existence of God. Namely, that if the universe had a beginning, as the Big Bang seems to point out, then it cries out for a cause outside of the universe, timeless, spaceless, intelligent, powerful, to come into existence, or you have to believe the universe came into existence from nothing. So I do believe in the Big Bang. I think there's a range of different scientific evidences that point to it. My whole faith is not rested upon the Big Bang, but I think it's remarkably coincidental that science in the 20th century, and I think it's interesting earlier, and this just shows a different way that you and I maybe look at the evidence. Ryan kind of described, and correct me if I'm wrong, the more science advanced, the more we kind of see these gaps filled and less room there is for God. I actually think it's the opposite of that. I think the more we probe the origin of the universe, we see that it's finite and it has a beginning, cries out to a cause outside of it. The more we probe the tiniest cell in your body and see that it has the equivalent of just 500,000 DVDs of information, that cries out for a cause that's powerful and great and intelligent. So I actually think the more we discover about science, and we have to be careful how we wed it with Genesis. I actually would agree with you on some of the early chapters of Genesis, what it's saying and what it's not. But I think the Christian position has consistently been of creatio ex nihilo, that the universe began at a finite point in the past. And it's more than just coincidental that that's what the scientific evidence seems to show today.
Thank you. We'll go to another question. Did you want to come
I want to
back?
ask
All right,
a quick
come back.
question, though. So,
All right.
and this again is long conversation, but do you then think that the cause of the Big Bang had a cause?
No, I don't.
So that God is the one thing that doesn't have a cause, that he exists out of nothing.
Well, it's not that God exists out of nothing. God, by definition, is uncaused. That's what we mean by God. So if the Big Bang had a cause, we would have to go back infinitely until there was some cause of it, which I think is mathematically absurd and impossible to go back for an infinity. There would have to be some uncaused, self-existent being that brings the universe into existence. That's what I would say by God. So God can't have a cause because God is by definition uncaused. That'd be like saying, what does the color blue smell like?
Isn't that begging the question, though, a little bit? Like, I mean, it's kind of like saying that everything has to have a cause except for my one thing that doesn't have to have a cause.
Yeah, well, I think the difference is, when we looked in the 20th century, both Christians and atheists would look back and say, gosh, the universe, there had to be some cause for the universe to come into existence. And what I'm saying is, no, this is not begging the question, because what we mean by God, by definition, long before we heard of the Big Bang, long before the cosmological argument, God is to be uncaused. That's what the definition bears. So if this definition was made up after the challenge of the Big Bang, then I think it would totally be ad hoc. But this is what's always, even Genesis 1, in the beginning, God assumes that God is timeless and self-existent. That's the Judeo-Christian view of God.
We'll leave Big Bang cosmology for now and see what other huge issue will be raised by our next question.
We're covering it all, man. Holy cow.
It's only 9:30.
I'll be brief. My name is Danny. I'm 14. No, I'm not. I'm just kidding.
Benjamin Button, everyone. Benjamin Button.
Big 5-0. So, I've been a police dispatcher for 25 years, and I've taken a lot of 911 calls, and I know for a fact people get up in the morning to go to work, and they end up at the morgue 2-3 hours later, and people die every day on the freeways and by all causes. So, Ryan, I have a question for you. First and foremost, I wish you a long and healthy life.
Thank you.
But there's going to be one day that we're all going to die, and we're going to be buried 6 feet under. And earlier you said you rather believe this is the life that you're satisfied with, and you're going to be put in a coffin and buried, and that's it. But my question to you is, what if you open your eyes and you say, uh-oh, this was not it?
Right.
And where do you go from there?
Yeah, so actually partway through my year, that's a great question, actually, and it's sort of like a variation on Pascal's wager in a sense, I didn't hedge my bets well or something. So So I guess, and this is again a possible version of God, right? So I actually think that there's a scenario in which God would be pleased that we used our brain and asked the questions. I even have this this kind of more, I don't know if you'll find it funny, but kind of this funny scenario in my head where it's like, okay, all you guys, you didn't even think about this question. You go over there. Like, the atheists, like, there's a special place in heaven for you because you actually thought about this, and I honestly didn't give you enough evidence, so congratulations. Like, you got it right, you know? I was like, so I'm like, really what that comes down to me, for me, is honesty. Like, I'm not playing a game. I genuinely am being honest, and if God exists and honors that honesty, then, you know, maybe I got a shot. If not, I'm willing to take my lumps.
Okay.
I never believed in an ever-burning hell to begin with. Let me just, you know, preface that. I was never taught the kind of Baptist hell where you burn and scorched in heat for eternity, and to me, that's like a monster. I can't even...
I mean, can I ask another question? Would you like it to be the case that you opened your eyes again and there was a God welcoming you in?
I don't know. Like, yeah, in a sense, that would be cool, right? I mean, it would be...
But is it kind of a one way or the other? I'm not too bothered either way.
I don't want to, like, burn in a fire for eternity.
Of
like,
course.
that doesn't sound good to me. But that's not a reason enough for me to, like, you know, change, like, what I, like, try to pretend to believe something I don't believe. But it would be great.
Because I have met atheists who say, I'd rather... when I'm 6 feet under, that's it. Then there's even a God who would welcome me in, because I
think the idea that the universe is benevolent, like that there's this benevolent God that has it all, you know, in his care or her care or whoever's care. Like, I think there's something really attractive about that. You know, that there's an arc to the universe, even though I maybe can't see it. There's something. I think the idea of eternity. I'm frightened of boredom. It's a very long time. And I don't, you know, so I don't know if I really want to live forever.
Okay. A quick response, and then we will have to take one final question. I'm sorry, all the people who are waiting in line. Please come and talk to us afterwards. We'll give you
And I'll be happy to stick around for a little while. I do need to run straight to the bathroom, though. And then I'll come back and talk to you.
Can you wait for one more question, Ryan?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I'll just quickly say two things. I do believe hell is real, but I don't believe in the hell that you reject in the way that you describe it. Topic for another day, but just to note, I don't think that's scripturally what the Bible teaches. Second, I don't know where the fellow went, but thank you for your 25 years of service as a cop. Thank you.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
all I have to say.
Great. Okay. Final question.
Hi, my name is JC, and I've been struggling with like science versus like religion, and I was just wondering, like, do you need to believe that God created the world, like, to go to heaven, or like, is it okay to believe in evolution? Because the gospel doesn't really say clearly that. It just says, like, believe that Jesus died, lived a perfect life, died, and rose from the dead. So, yeah.
Do you want to take that one,
I'm
Sean?
assuming that's for me.
Yeah.
I'm going to let you take that one. But it's a really heartfelt question. I mean, yeah, I'm moved by the question.
Yeah. First off, thank you for your honesty and willingness to share this. I think one of the most caustic thing to a person's faith, according to Kara Powell and Chap Clark's research at Fuller Seminary, they did research called the College Transition Project, and they said so many students lose their faith when they have doubts and they just don't have room to process it. So you're a model. If people have questions, ask them. Go out there. Go for it. We shouldn't be afraid of questions. So good for you. The quick answer, and this can get me in some trouble, is we do have to believe that God is the creator, but exactly how God creates is a secondary issue in terms of our salvation. So if God used evolution in some fashion, then God would still be the creator. Jesus still came down and took on human flesh. He died on the cross, and the core truths can be there. So I don't want you to feel like embracing maybe what you learn in biology class means the entire Christian faith is false, okay? As long as you believe God is a creator. Now, with that said, I don't believe, just because I've looked at the evidence, that there's an adequate explanation from random mutation and natural selection being a sufficient mechanism to explain the complexity and diversity of life, I'm just not persuaded by it. So I'd encourage you to read, and Pastor Kevin, jump in here and help out. Maybe read some books on both sides. Look at the evidence. And one thing I found is you can't study every issue. I mean, we've covered 1 million issues. But for me, one thing I did is I said, I'm going to take an issue or two and really study that issue and see if I find a satisfactory answer. And that gives me confidence in the areas I can't spend as much time. So if that's true for you, I know Pastor Kevin, you would help her out. Give her some books on both sides, read it, talk it through, spend some time really looking at it and see what you think makes the most sense.
Do you want to add anything to that?
No, it's great advice. I mean, I think that I remember being taught when I was a child growing up in the church, there were these faithful Bereans, right, that didn't accept just what was told to them. They went and searched for themselves to find out what was true. And I think this is the honesty that I'm talking about. I don't think even God can fault you for trying to understand what's true. And
truth matters.
Truth matters, yeah. It's
on the back.
We can all agree on that.
Great, it's a great place to stop. Can we just give a great round of applause for Sean and Ryan?
Yeah, I felt that they covered each side of the issues pretty well. I know they were on a time crunch, but they did it in a way that was very mentally stimulating.
The debate, basically, I think, well, not debate, it's a conversation. It went really well, in my opinion. We need more things like this. Simply put, where believers and unbelievers sit together and have a civil conversation.
I'd say overall for me, not being too informed on both sides of the topics when it comes to atheism and Christianity. Overall, it was like a pleasing seminar to watch, and I was constantly captivated with the professionalism that they brought to everybody, and the way they articulated their words was very professional, and yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I think they both brought up really good points of the discussion and how Ryan transformed from a Christian to an atheist. He also has some supporting views, as well as McDowell. He also has his Christian perspective.
I did like how the story, they each had their own stories and brought it to the table really well, and especially with Ryan, his background was very different than a lot of atheists, being a pastor and that kind of thing, so just a good diversity of a group coming in and talking was great.
It's very courageous in a sense for a church to do this kind of an event, because you're really opening yourself up to lots of big questions, which probably you thought of already anyway, but yeah, it's usually my experience is a lot of churches want to kind of like protect people from those experiences and not just expose them. So I like the fact that this church is open like that. It's great.
I think that's definitely something that Pastor Kevin has been doing. Like,
yeah,
really wants to prepare us for the outside world. Because like,
yeah,
once we're out of high school and we're moving out, it's totally different.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Sean. If something isn't true, whether it's Christianity or anything, then you shouldn't believe it. Why would you want to believe something that wasn't true if you could find out? So I tell people I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as I can. We're all going to be somewhere stuck in the middle of that, but yeah, it's a good pursuit. You should always go for that. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, of course.
Yeah, really, really great to be here.
It was a great evening. I really enjoyed the interaction between Sean and Ryan. I thought they were two really well-matched guests, and both funny, both vibrant, but both with some really important things to say, and some great questions from the audience as well. And the time flew by, as it often does, so I was really glad to be here.
Hey Sean,
thank you.
Real quick, how did you feel? How was it?
I'm exhausted. Honestly, it was fun. I think people are walking away saying we talked about the big issues, but with respect and with kindness and with fun. So I feel good about it. I certainly learned a lot and had a great time.
Thank you so much for coming out.
Kudos to the church for putting this on. Honestly, it'd be easy not to tackle issues like this. I'm walking away encouraged that there's a church like this and so many young people willing to talk about issues of this magnitude. So keep it up.
Thank you so much.